Hello, my name is Matthew Marquit and welcome to the third video in the Unreal Engine 4 Basics tutorial series. In this particular video, we're going to be covering 3D transform tools, or basically any tools that allows us to manipulate objects within the viewport so that we can create the levels in the games that we want. Now let's start with the basics, and you really can't get any more basic than your move, your rotation, and your scale. And we can see up here, here's our move, our rotate, and our scale. The hotkeys are W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale respectively. So let's go back to move. Now we see that this is known as a pivot or a gizmo, okay, this object here, and it's lined up with the world at the moment here. So we can see that the green arrow is the green line right here, which is Y, and we can move it on any of those constraints. So I can constrain it to just Z, just Y, and so on, right? I can also constrain it to multiple axes at the same time, as long as they're both highlighted yellow, as we can see here. And also, technically, I can grab it right in the middle so that it doesn't have any constraint and just kind of moves on all three axes at once. But it doesn't make a lot of sense. It just kind of goes flying everywhere, and you never know where it's going to go. So I find that that's fairly useless. Now, let's talk about snaps real quick. So each one of these tools have snaps. Okay, and so move's snap is right here. This is the grid snap. If it's on, automatically, you'll see when I go to move, it kind of pops, right? And it's moving 10 units. That's what this is. And 10 units in Unreal is centimeters. So 10 centimeters, it's popping every time. Now you can change that number to anything. Say let's go to 50 here, and you'll see that it'll pop only in 50 units of 50. Okay, and so on, right? But the default is set to 10. You can completely shut it off by clicking on this, but I do not recommend it. You want to keep things on grids so that they stay and so that things line up nicely when you're building it. But yeah, just so you know, that is where the grid snap is. Now the next one is rotation, so E. And if I grab on any of these axes, you can see we get a little compass there with a angle telling us whether we're in the positive or the negative, right? And you can see that that's also snapping at 10-degree increments, which we can see if we go up here, right? We have it set to 10. You can set that to any of these increments, any of these divisions of 360, or you can completely shut it off. But once again, I recommend keeping it on. Now I'm going to undo this rotation here, right? But one thing you will notice about the rotation is you can't grab it multiple axes at once, mostly because it wouldn't make a lot of sense. It would just get all twisted in weird ways and it wouldn't really matter. So the last thing, which is R or scale, so click on the object and we hit R. Right here is our scale. So there's two things that you can do with scale, and that is scale it uniformly and non-uniformly. Uniformly is grabbing it in the middle so that it scales 1-to-1 and everything scales at the same speed, the same time. Or you can grab, say, one direction and either shrink it way in, right, or scale it way out. Okay. Now keep in mind that on a generic box that doesn't have a texture, that looks fine, but on something, say, like this, on our first-person template decal, if I was to stretch it way out, it's going to look wrong, right, or smush it way in. So you do have to be careful when scaling objects as to not distort them so much that they look really odd. Okay. Now you also have your scale snap here. Right now it's set to 25% or 0.25. So every time I scale it, it will only go 25% of its original size. Okay. You can even set it to, like, say 1. That would be basically double every time. So every time I scale it up, it's literally going to be one more increment, or like 100% increase. Okay. So this one we're going to set back to 0.25 or 25%. All right, so those are basically your move, your rotate, and your scale, but there's one last thing I wanted to talk about in regards to those, and that is this, which is your world or object space. Now, if I was to say click on this button, right now it's set to world, I click it into object space, we don't see a difference, and that's because the object itself isn't off the world space. Well, one way to get it off the world space is to take the rotational tool and rotate it. So you can see right here, now I'm going to actually go to a top view because this might be a little bit more obvious. I'm going to set this to lit, and then zoom up on the object there with F. And so the object's been rotated, and you'll notice that if I go back to my move tool, now my world coordinates are lined up still with the world as we see down here. Okay, if, however, I click this again and go to local space, you'll notice the coordinates now match the direction of the object so that I can move it in that way. It works just the same with rotation. As you can see, rotation matches the object or the world, depending on I click on this button. However, scale only does local or object space. No world space, because if you're trying to scale it in world space, it wouldn't make any sense, right? It would just get skewed in two directions at the same time, not at the same speed, and it would look really, really weird, right? So there'd be no reason for that, so the engine doesn't even allow you to do that. So let's go back to our perspective view here. And I want to talk about the next section, which is details transform. Okay, so details transform. That is found right here. Here's our details tab, and underneath that is our transform section. The transform section is broken into location, rotation, and scale. So before I was grabbing this and we were just eyeballing it, right? So, oh, it looks good here, looks good here, right? But if you want to put an exact number in, you can type them in here. So right here I can even see what my rotational value is. So you can tell this thing's off kilter and I rotated it to 30 degrees. If I go in and type in 0 here, it's now back at its original form, which is 0, 0, and 0. Now you can also move it that way, so if I know exactly where I want it, say on the X value, I want to move it to 900 centimeters from the initial center point of the world, I type in 900 and enter, and you'll see it will move, right? It was like 800 and something before, so that's why I didn't move all that far. But you can actually put the exact numbers that you want down in here, and it works the same with scale. Now, if you want something to be uniformly scaled, it would be silly to type in the same number over and over again, because let's just say I type in 4 and hit enter here. You'll see that now I have to go in and change these other two. Right? If you want an ununiform scale or non-uniform scale, yeah, put that number in. But if you want it to be uniform, and I'm going to set that back to 2, click on the lock and then just type in 4 and enter, and then all of them will update just the same. Now the last little section, right, that we see here, right, is our movability, and this is based on whether it's a physics object or not. If it's physics, it's a, you can shoot it, it moves around, it's an elevator, you'll have it set to movable. This is a movable object. If you actually played the game, you can go shoot that and you'll see it bouncing around, right? But in most cases, we're just going to use static, right, because it helps with the rendering of the game. Okay, it keeps things a little bit more simple, less processing power. Okay, so that is in general that section. So let's talk about some more complex features. Okay, so some of them, whoops, and I'm moving this here by mistake, but some of these features, right, are snapping, surface snapping, I should say, because we did cover other types of snapping, and moving your pivot. And there's a couple of reasons why you want to do that. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So surface snapping is this. This object right here, we can click on, turn on surface snapping, and if we grab with the move tool right in the center of the object, right here, we can snap it based on that pivot's location. Now the pivot itself is actually in the center. Right, now I do have something else I want to note. There's something else you can click on. You can have rotate to surface normal so that it matches the surface of the object. So if I click that on and then do surface snapping, you'll see it actually rotates and matches whatever surface it's on. So it does this kind of little weird rotation here. Right, and that's only so useful, of course, because it is based on the pivot point. Right, but we can change the pivot point, and I want to show you how you do that. So let me undo the movement so it's kind of above the ground here. I'm going to undo a bunch here so we get back to its initial. There we go. And we're going to go, say, to a front view, right? So click on front view. All right. Now, if you want to change the pivot, we can see right here it's right in the middle. You're going to hold down Alt. You're going to press the middle mouse button, and you're going to move it down. Now, your screen isn't going to change like that. That's just me because my hotkey gets pressed every time I push my middle mouse button. But if I switch this up, I'm going to take surface snaps off for a second here, and I'm also going to shut off my grid snapping so I can get this lined up where I want. So boop, right there, and then I can go right here into the corner, right? And then to make sure it's exactly in a corner, well, instead of a front, we'll go to maybe a left view, and then we'll line that up to another corner, right? So now we know for certain that it's in a corner because it's in a corner. Both of those views are going to go back to perspective, and there you go. It's right there in the corner. Now, if I was to click off this object, that pivot will reset when I select it back again. It's only temporary, right? But if you don't want it to be temporary, you want it to be permanent, right-click on the object, scroll down to the bottom, choose Pivot, and then choose Set as Pivot Offset. Okay, once you do that, it is now permanently there. I can select a different object. As you can see, it's in the center of that object. Come over here, and there we go, right? So now I can move it based on that pivot. Now, part of the reason why that's important is, let's say, this particular object, and let's go back to top view, okay? And I'm going to switch this back to lit, and we'll hit F to zoom up on that, and we'll see these two objects here, the one with the pivots in the corner and the one with the pivots over here. Now, the one in the center, if I say go to rotate it, you'll see that it rotates based on where that pivot is, which is the center of the object. If I move the pivot and rotate this, you'll see that it rotates from that point, kind of like a door, right? So a door is kind of shutting from that point. So that's part of the reason why you might want to move the pivot point of an object, okay? Now, the last thing I did kind of want to talk about, so And by the way, if you do ever want to reset that, I should mention this. If you do ever want to reset, I'm going to go back to my perspective here, that pivot point, right-click the object, go to pivot, and then choose reset pivot offset, and it'll put it right back to where it was initially. Okay, but yes, the last thing, the true last thing I want to talk about here is how you select objects. Right, so this is kind of important, right? Because you're not always selecting one object. Yeah, selecting one object is you click on it. Wonderful. But how do you select more than one object? Well, there's a couple ways of doing that. Obviously, we can click on this, but if we hold down Alt, we can actually add to the selection. Or I should say Control. Sorry, not, and for some reason it says Alt here, but ignore that. It is actually Control. And I'm going to click on these, and you can see with Control, I add to it. So now I have 3 objects selected. If I want to deselect, I can also use the same Control, right, and deselect using those. Now you also notice that the pivot itself kind of spawns wherever you click the last object, right? So you can kind of see that as I add or take away, it kind of does that. But what if I want all of these, just to say, because I grabbed a bunch of objects at once and I want to rotate them in the middle of all of the objects, not based on this object, right? Because you'll see how they rotate this way. Same thing with the pivot. We right click, we go to pivot, and then we can choose right here, center on selection, and it'll put it right in the center of the selection, and then now I can rotate that entire selection based on its center. Right? And then the last way to select objects, okay, is to hold down Control and Alt at the same time, and then if you use the left mouse button, you'll make a little box selection. Anything inside that box gets selected. So you can do that in any view, right? And then that way you can basically select multiple objects at once. And then of course the last way of selecting multiple objects is just kind of coming in here. You can hold down Shift and grab a bunch in a row, or you can click on one and then hold down Control and click on another one down here, and so on. And you'll see that it will actually select objects just the same that way. So those are your multiple ways of selecting objects. But in general, that does cover your transform tools. And so hopefully you learned a couple of new things. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.